When you really start to peel back the layers of everyone around John Ramsey, friends, colleagues, relatives, neighbors, background characters, it gets less about pointing fingers and more about understanding the environment that allowed so much to go unanswered. It's not always about who had the clearest motive or who behaved the strangest afterward. Sometimes it's about who was close enough to know just a little too much, but not close enough to be scrutinized. And that's where things get interesting. When you think about how narrative control works, who speaks up, who stays silent, who's remembered for what, it paints a picture of a family not just dealing with tragedy, but managing perception, connections, and damage control in real time. What's also worth sitting with is how different kinds of access, emotional, logistical, financial, physical, created a web where just about anyone on the fringe could have seen something, known something, or done something, and still faded back into the crowd. And the thing about crimes like this is that they aren't always committed by the obviously unstable or the conveniently angry. Sometimes they're carried out by someone operating within a fog of familiarity, someone who the family didn't fear because they never had reason to. And that's why it's not just about looking at the center, it's about looking at who the center was trying to protect, avoid, or forget. That's where the tension lives. So let's kind of walk through each individual to get a better sense of who might have been around John Ramsey and what they may mean to the case. Tom Carson, in a 1997 Patsy interview with the Boulder Police Department, Patsy Ramsey noted that the police had thoroughly checked Tom Carson out. She was not aware of any specific issues between Tom and John Ramsey, suggesting that any questions about their work relationship would be better directed to John. Later, in a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John Ramsey identified Tom Carson as their chief financial officer at Access Graphics, who was already in that position when John joined the company. John described their working relationship as awkward, finding Tom to be always a drain for him. He even considered the possibility that Tom could have a motive for the crime, especially since Lockheed, the parent company, had signaled their disinterest in Access Graphics, which could have led to Tom losing his position if Lockheed replaced him with their own CFO. However, John found it almost inconceivable that Tom could be involved, as Tom had attended JonBenet's memorial and funeral in Atlanta. John also noted that Tom, along with his secretary Denise, would have been highly aware of his schedule. Rod Westmoreland. In a 1997 Patsy interview with the Boulder Police Department, Patsy recalled that John had called Rod Westmoreland, our friend and our stockbroker in Atlanta, to arrange for the ransom money. This highlights their close personal and professional ties. During a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John confirmed this, stating he called Rod Westmoreland, his stockbroker and friend, early on the morning of December 26th, around 7 or 7:30 a.m., to get the money together. Rod was reportedly either at home or at his parents' place in Mississippi at the time. In their book, The Death of Innocence, John Ramsey reiterated his gratitude for Rod's immediate arrival from Atlanta to assist with the ransom, emphasizing the significant sacrifice Rod made by traveling during the busy Christmas season. Rod even pressed the police on how many officers were assigned to the case, demonstrating his active support. During the 2000 August John interview in Atlanta, John elaborated on Rod Westmoreland's role, mentioning that Rod hosted a little reception for friends after JonBenet's funeral. John described Rod's home in Atlanta as beautiful and acknowledged Rod's wealth, saying it was not a stretch for him to have it. John's friends at this reception, including himself, were humorously referred to as Atlanta fat cats, a phrase that appeared in the ransom note. The Death of Innocence further reveals a strained interaction with Fleet and Priscilla White, who were initially scheduled to stay at Rod Westmoreland's home in Atlanta. John noted that Rod is an in-control person. However, after the funeral, John's brother Jeff recalled Fleet complaining about the Westmoreland's exclusive neighborhood and Priscilla being offended by their maid, ultimately leading to them leaving Rod's house and staying with Jeff. This nearly got crosswise with the Westmorelands, who are described as two of the nicest people you'll ever meet. Jay Alowski. In a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John Ramsey confirmed a close relationship with Jay, stating, "Yeah, I know Pasta Jay real well because they were business partners. John and his family frequented Pasta Jay's restaurant lots, yeah. With John visiting at least twice a week and his family at least once a week, John affectionately mentioned that JonBenet grew up at Pasta Jay's and that the waitresses there kind of adopted her as sort of a surrogate child." Their book, The Death of Innocence, mentions that John and Patsy had visited Pasta Jay's after church on Christmas Eve. The book also states that a loaded 9mm pistol and a baseball bat were found under the seat of Jay's car, leading to a felony charge that was later plea bargained to misdemeanor menacing, as carrying a gun in a car is legal in Colorado. The JonBenet forensic files list J. Olowski as a background investigation item, along with an employee named Gardenier. Mike Bynum, according to a December 26, 1996, police supplemental report JonBenet Ramsey, Mike Bynum was identified as both a friend of John Ramsey and an attorney, providing him with advice. In The Death of Innocence, Mike Bynum is highlighted as a personal friend who was also an attorney, and whose guidance John and Patsy relied upon. Mike took a proactive role, confronting detectives and asserting that there would be no interviews at the police station due to the Ramseys' distraught state. John believed this interaction likely initiated the infamous Ramseys not cooperating with police headlines. Glenn Stein, a 1997 Patsy interview with the Boulder Police Department, mentions that Burke Ramsey plays with Doug Stein. The Stein family's connection is further detailed in a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, where John states he and Patsy traveled to New York with Susan and Glenn Stein for a weekend in December. Susan Stein is also noted as a friend who relayed information about a supporter's website. In The Death of Innocence, Glenn and Susan Stein are prominently acknowledged for their extensive support, including giving of your time and your hearts in so many countless ways, and are described as protectors. After the murder, they graciously took the Ramseys into their home, providing a safe haven even when the media converged on it. They are also listed among the other good friends who gathered at the Fernie's house following the tragedy. The JonBenet forensic files corroborate this by including background of Susan Stein, close Ramsey family friend, as an investigative item. Okay, let's go through this first group. Tom Carson stands out as a figure of subtle friction. John calls their relationship awkward and says Tom was always a drain. That's not a throwaway comment. It signals a power imbalance, or maybe just a personality mismatch that John never reconciled. What's funny is that Tom was already the CFO when John joined Access Graphics, meaning Tom may have perceived John as the interloper, not the other way around. If Lockheed was already signaling disinterest in Access Graphics, and if a leadership shakeup was looming, then sure, Tom had motive, even if John ultimately found it almost inconceivable. But that inconceivability seems to rest more on decorum. Tom showed up to the memorial, after all, than on hard elimination. In forensic criminology, perceived civility can create blind spots, especially when social rituals like funerals mask tension. And from a philosophical point of view, motive isn't always conscious. It can be passive-aggressive, even symbolic. Ron Westmoreland is trickier. On the surface, he's the loyal friend, the stockbroker, the guy John calls at 7 a.m. to gather the ransom money. That's a heavy ask, and Rod answered the call, literally. But what's interesting is how intertwined Ron is with John's image of stability and wealth. He's in control, has a beautiful home, and moves in elite social circles. The ransom note calling John's friends fat cats has to be viewed with this in mind. Maybe it's just coincidence, but if the killer knew enough to reference that phrase, and knew where the Westmorelands lived, and how that lifestyle might cause friction, then there's a deeper level of personalization at play. What might be worth considering is that people like Rod, who embody John's financial world, also represent vulnerability if the killer wanted to send a message that John's wealth would protect him. And ironically, that puts Rod in the center of the symbolic attack, even if not the physical one. Pasta J. Olowski, is emotionally closer than most realize. JonBenet practically grew up at his restaurant, and the waitresses adopted her. This isn't just about food, it's about routine, comfort, community. That kind of closeness can sometimes distort boundaries. Jay's loaded gun and baseball bat found under the seat of his car sounds like throwaway detail, but it's not. It shows a man who was either paranoid, threatened, or operating in a world where he expected violence. And it's also weird that he plea bargained that down. There's something about Jay's archetype, the jolly restaurateur with a temper, fitting into a broader criminological theme, the public figure who lives a second life. He was background checked, so someone flagged it. Maybe they saw something in the way he hovered around the family too closely, or maybe his felony didn't matter because the narrative already had its villains. Mike Bynum is more calculated. He's not just a friend, he's a legal shield. The second the police tried to bring the Ramseys in, Bynum stepped up and said, "No interviews." That's a power move. And what's funny is that this one action basically sparked the entire Ramseys are stonewalling media firestorm. So in a sense, Bynum became the trigger for a national perception shift. Now, from John's perspective, Bynum is a savior, someone who protected their crumbling world. But from the angle of forensic psychology, it's also worth noting how fast the Ramseys turned to legal counsel before even engaging with investigators. That either signals deep trauma or a foregone expectation of needing protection. And you have to ask yourself, who thinks like that unless they already expect legal war? Maybe Mike wasn't the mastermind, but he sure controlled the narrative early on, and narrative control is everything in a crime that lacks a clean forensic trail. Glenn and Susan Stein are like the Ramseys' emotional life raft. After the murder, they took them in, offered them shelter, even acted as buffers from the press. That's not a small thing, but philosophically, when someone offers you total protection, there's always an implicit transaction, whether emotional, reputational, or logistical, it costs something. And while the Steins seem loving and generous, the forensic lens would ask, how does this level of closeness affect memory, influence, or loyalty? The Steins weren't just family friends, they were protectors. And sometimes protectors don't ask hard questions. Sometimes they unintentionally insulate suspects from confrontation. It's also odd that Susan was a go-between for online supporters, almost like a handler. That's a level of involvement beyond sympathy. It's image management. Now, if we zoom out, the philosophical tension here is between proximity and suspicion. Every person in this group is close to John in different ways, financially, emotionally, professionally. But proximity doesn't cancel motive. If anything, it complicates it. Someone like Carson had professional angst. Someone like Rod had wealth symbolism. Jay had access and emotional familiarity. Bynum had narrative power. The Steins had physical control of the family's location. So in theory, if anyone in this group had knowledge of secrets, patterns, vulnerabilities, or even the house itself, then they were all close enough to either prevent or participate, or at the very least, to shape the aftermath. Also, consider how everyone in this group either appeared publicly or was discussed publicly in the death of innocents. That's interesting. It's as if John wanted to curate who stayed in the spotlight. Philosophically, you could argue that guilt creates a need for controlled chaos. Keeping familiar faces in the story reinforces innocence by association. But from a criminology perspective, what's also strange is that almost none of these people are ever re-interviewed or recentered later as the years passed. Why is that? Either the case went cold so fast that suspicion died with the headlines, or these figures served their symbolic roles early on and were never expected to yield any more. And what might be worth noting as a final thought is that this group, collectively, reflects John Ramsey's internal world more than anyone else. His allies, his armor, his professional status, his social script. And if the crime was personal, and we have every reason to believe it was, then maybe this group wasn't about who did it, but who the killer wanted to hurt through it. And maybe, just maybe, the killer knew that the people closest to John would be the ones least likely to see it coming, or least willing to say what they saw. Moving on then, let's kind of look at some of the other men close to John Ramsey. On Fleet White. Fleet White was a close family friend. In a 1997 Patsy interview with the Boulder Police Department, Patsy recalled Fleet taking Burke to the Whites' home following the discovery of JonBenet's body. She also expressed suspicions about Fleet's potential involvement due to erratic behavior he exhibited shortly after JonBenet was found, though she also described him as a very loving father and Mr. Mom who was often available. John Ramsey, in a 1998 June interview with Smith and Kane, stated that Fleet and Burke were buddies. He also noted that he had known Fleet for 2 or 3 years and they had sailed together, forming a bond over their shared activity. John observed Fleet taking frantic notes on a yellow notepad shortly after the 10 a.m. deadline for the kidnapper's call passed. John also thought that Fleet often used his name in conversation, saying John this, which he found unusual. He considered Fleet and Priscilla their closest friends. Notably, John speculated that the tape used on JonBenet might be something Fleet would possess, recalling Fleet having special tapes for boat preparation. Fleet also claimed to have searched the basement alone. During the 2000 August John interview in Atlanta, John stated that he and Patsy had not eliminated anyone, including Priscilla White, as a suspect. He reiterated that Fleet's behavior after the murder was extremely bizarre. John stated that John Fernie would not allow Fleet on an airplane because he seemed too out of control. After the funeral, Fleet and Priscilla were supposed to stay with the Westmorelands, but reportedly had an argument and instead stayed with John's brother, Jeff. John's brother even called him, expressing concern that Fleet had a gun and was extremely dangerous. The death of innocents further explains that Fleet was with John when JonBenet's body was discovered. Fleet had tried to intervene with the media to stop horrible and false accusations about John Andrew. Upon arriving in Atlanta, Fleet vehemently argued against the Ramseys retaining attorneys, instead pushing for them to appear on national television. John observed that their friendship lacked friction prior to JonBenet's death, implying a change in Fleet's demeanor afterward. The Burke-Ramsey vs. CBS document confirms that John and Fleet initiated the search in the basement. It also states that Fleet urged John to stop hiding behind his lawyer and to cooperate with the police. And John Fernie, John, and Barbara Fernie were close friends of the Ramsey family. In a 1997 John interview with the Boulder Police Department, John mentioned that the family stayed at the Fernie's house after leaving their own home. During the initial chaotic hours on December 26th, John Fernie went to the bank to handle issues related to the ransom money. He was present when JonBenet's body was found and was in the solarium with John and others. Trying to understand the situation, a friend of the Fernies, whom John met through them, lived nearby. A 1997 Patsy interview with the Boulder Police Department mentions that Luke Fernie was one of Burke's buddies, and the Fernies, including John, Barbara, and their children, were guests at the Christmas party on December 23rd. In a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John mentioned that an attorney friend of John Fernie's, who happened to be delivering food from Pasta J's, intervened when police attempted to take the Ramseys for an interview, sensing something was amiss. During the 2000 August John interview in Atlanta, John described John and Barbara Fernie as good friends and good family friends. However, he noted that Barbara had emotional problems before the tragedy, and John Fernie later asked Patsy not to contact Barbara, as she was struggling to cope with the events. John had spoken to John Fernie a few times since June 1998. DNA analysis results from the JonBenet forensic files exclude John Fernie as a source of DNA on certain exhibits. Mike Archuleta, in a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John identified Mike Archuleta as the head of the charter company that operated John's airplane, and who became a friend. Mike was slated to fly the Ramseys to Minneapolis on December 26. John called Mike early that morning to help connect with his older children, who were already flying. Mike even volunteered to pick them up in Minneapolis. The JonBenet forensic files indicate that a buccal swab was collected from Mike Archuleta. Mike Archuleta is also noted in the Burke Ramsey versus CBS document as stating that he was not asked to testify in the grand jury. When Don Paul, according to a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, Don Paul had an office next to John's. Don's name was brought up by John as someone who used the phrase grow a brain in reference to the media. Don typically traveled by limo to the airport. Don Paul also resided in the corporate apartment that Access Graphics maintained, where John, Patsy, and Burke had also lived for a period. Other employees sometimes stayed there temporarily instead of a hotel. And Jeff Merrick, in a 1997 Patsy interview with the Boulder Police Department, Patsy recalled Jeff Merrick, an individual John had known for several years, possibly from AT&T, who was asked to resign from Access Graphics. John and Patsy's father were concerned about threats Jeff was reportedly making against the company. Ellis, their investigator, had provided Jeff's name to the authorities. John Ramsey, in a 1998 June interview with Smith and Kane, elaborated that Jeff Merrick was a friend from his post-Navy days at AT&T, with whom he stayed in touch. Jeff was described as a real talker. John indicated that Jeff had written a big, long letter about him, Don, and Access Graphics, which led to a weeks-long investigation by Lockheed, though everything was eventually cleared. John also noted that Jeff was a very hostile individual and found Jeff's wife kind of strange. Jeff's termination, approximately 5 months before December 26, 1996, was a factor John considered when thinking about potential suspects. John recalled that Jeff received severance and outplacement counseling, with the total amount possibly reaching $250,000. Their book, The Death of Innocence, mentions John informing the police about Jeff Merrick, who left very angry after being released from the company. The JonBenet forensic files also mention a former Access Graphics employee, Sandra Henderson, who owed $118,000, the same amount as the ransom note, due to financial issues, raising a potential connection. Focusing on the second group then, Fleet White is probably one of the most complicated figures in this whole mess. On one hand, he's described as one of John's closest friends. They sailed together, their families mingled, and Fleet was even present when JonBenet's body was found. But what's funny is how quickly that intimacy unraveled. Patsy called his behavior erratic, John thought he was taking frantic notes, and later on, Fleet was almost painted as dangerous, possibly even armed and unstable. Now, if we're being honest, that's a massive shift in perception. From a criminological lens, this kind of post-trauma volatility often triggers suspicion, but not necessarily because someone did something, more because they can no longer be controlled by the existing narrative. Fleet didn't want lawyers involved. He wanted public exposure. That kind of boldness challenges secrecy, and secrecy was the Ramsey strategy. So even if Fleet wasn't a perpetrator, he became an ideological threat, an oppositional force to the family's tightening circle. John Fernie is different. He didn't fracture like Fleet did, but he sat close enough to the fire to absorb all the heat. He helped get the ransom money moving. He was physically present during key moments. He housed the family. And yet, later, We get this detail that Barbara Fernie, his wife, was emotionally unstable and had to be distanced. That's a peculiar shift. You'd think someone so integral would be forever locked in the trusted camp. But from a deductive standpoint, it's worth considering what Barbara might have seen or picked up on. Emotional breakdowns in close proximity to trauma often hint at suppressed truths, or at least inconvenient ones. And the idea that Fernie brought in a friend, an attorney no less, to deliver food and intervene in a police interview is suspiciously convenient. It almost feels like legal strategy dressed as casual friendship. That blend of roles creates plausible deniability, but also shows how layered their web of protection really was. Mike Archuleta seems like a side character, but he might have known more than people realize. He was John's pilot, someone John trusted to transport his family on the day of the murder. He was in the loop early, possibly one of the first outside their home to be contacted. That matters. From a logistics standpoint, pilots hear everything: conversations, scheduling conflicts, emotional tone, and even whispers. If John was trying to coordinate with his other kids and Mike was helping, then he became a witness to the emotional cadence of the day: who said what, how quickly things were decided, and whether something seemed off. And philosophically, when someone becomes part of a crisis plan, even passively, it implies trust. But trust doesn't cancel out suspicion. If anything, it raises the bar for what someone should have noticed. That's the thing with helpers in crime scenes. They sometimes end up knowing too much without realizing it. Don Paul isn't just a corporate figure floating around the periphery. He's family. Patsy's father, JonBenet's grandfather. That shifts everything. And it also makes the office next door detail and shared use of the corporate apartment even more significant. This isn't just about logistics. It's about closeness, integration, enmeshment. Don helped John get Access Graphics off the ground, which tells us he was more than a passive in-law. He was part of John's professional success story. That adds another layer to motive dynamics. Philosophically, when a man builds his legacy with his father-in-law's help, the power dynamics get strange. Gratitude, dependence, pride, and occasionally quiet resentment all swirl together. It's worth considering whether Don saw the family spiraling before the public did, and his presence in the same office space puts him in proximity to tension. He may have seen marital strain, workplace stress, or even odd emotional shifts in Patsy leading up to the murder. But what's interesting is how little he seems to be discussed in the aftermath. That's not to say he was involved, far from it, but rather that sometimes family members closest to the emotional implosion are kept in a quiet holding pattern, too close to question, too painful to implicate. In criminology, that's often where key witnesses go unnoticed, not because they're hiding anything, but because everyone assumes they're just family. But if anyone could have sensed what was boiling underneath, Patsy's state of mind, Burke's behavior, John's distractions, it would have been the man in the background who built the foundation they were all living on. Jeff Merrick is another one of those people who keeps coming up because of unresolved tension. He was asked to resign, wrote long letters criticizing John and Access Graphics, and left angry. That's motive, at least superficially. But what's worth noting is that Jeff wasn't just a stranger with a grudge. He was someone John had known for years, all the way back to AT&T. That makes this personal. And personal grievances tend to linger in weird ways. John says he received severance, up to $250,000, so it's not like Merrick was left broke. But sometimes money doesn't erase humiliation. And from a forensic framing perspective, this is exactly the kind of profile law enforcement loves to focus on: aggrieved mail, corporate rejection, potential access, angry letters. But what's funny is that while Merrick's name floats around in the early documents, he never reemerges with new leads or contradictions. Either that means there was nothing there, or it means someone worked hard to put that fire out fast. What's interesting is how this entire group sits on a sliding scale of an access. Some had physical access, others had emotional access, and others had professional or logistical access. And in cases like JonBenet's, where the crime appears highly controlled, tight time window, familiar environment, no signs of forced entry, that kind of access becomes everything. From a criminological angle, access equals opportunity. And when opportunity is coupled with motive, whether it's emotional, ideological, or financial, you've got a suspect profile. The issue here is that everyone in this group had some kind of access, and yet no one was charged. That doesn't mean they were cleared. It might just mean that the legal architecture around them was strong enough to shield them from deeper scrutiny. Philosophically, there's also something strange about how fast the Ramseys turned on some of these people. Fleet went from buddy to potential maniac in a matter of weeks. The Fernies went from protectors to emotionally unstable liabilities. Merrick went from colleague to corporate threat. That pattern, drawing people in and then pushing them away, is classic in high-stakes trauma or cover-up scenarios. It creates a clean perimeter. Keep the loyal ones close, push the volatile ones out, and paint the picture of chaos outside the core. That's narrative containment. And it works, especially when the media runs with those storylines. And what might be worth really pondering is how many of these people represent something John was trying to control. Fleet represented independence. Fernie represented logistics. Archuleta represented movement. Merrick represented a public wound. Each one of them, in their own way, reflects a part of John's world that was becoming too unpredictable. So maybe the question isn't just who did what, but whose behavior became too dangerous after the crime. And if we follow that thread, we might not find the killer, but we might find out who was silenced, subtly, indirectly, or socially, because they just knew too much. Jack Logan. In a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John identified Jack Logan as a weirdo who surfaced later and was reportedly seen in a pickup truck in the alley, washing it. John stated he did not know Jack before the murder, but Jack would approach him in church afterward, offering sympathy. Blood samples from Jack Logan are listed in the JonBenet forensic files. In Dr. Buff, in a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John referred to him as Dr. Bob, their family pediatrician and a friend of ours. Dr. Buff was JonBenet's and Burke's pediatrician and was present at the Fernie's house primarily as a friend offering concern. John believed Dr. Buff might have prescribed medication for Patsy early on because he was there. A December 2006, 1996 police supplemental report JonBenet Ramsey states that Dr. Buff informed Sergeant Mason that Patsy was too medicated to talk to anyone and had given her Valium, indicating her fragile emotional state. And Stuart and Roxy Walker are listed as other good friends who came to the Fernie's house after the murder in the death of innocence. In a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John mentioned them in the context of camping, though he couldn't recall if they engaged in it. DNA records in the JonBenet forensic files indicate that blood samples were collected from both Stuart Walker and Roxana Walker. In David Williams, in a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John stated he wrote the reward letter in David Williams' kitchen in Denver. David Williams was also present during John's interview with Smith and Kane as co-counsel. The 2001 December John Ramsey deposition identifies David Williams as a principal investigator hired by the Ramseys' attorneys, described as a former cop with years of experience who had previously worked with the Haddon, Morgan, and Foreman law firm. And John Andrew Ramsey. As John Ramsey's older son from a previous marriage, John Andrew was 22 years old at the time of JonBenet's death. In a 1997 John interview with the Boulder Police Department, John recalled sitting in John Andrew's room after finding JonBenet. John Andrew was in Atlanta in December 1996. Patsy recalled that John Andrew had slept in his room, and one of his friends had also slept there. In a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John mentioned that his older children, John Andrew and Melinda, were traveling from Atlanta to Minneapolis to meet the family for a planned Florida trip. John Andrew was one of the callers who contacted the Ramseys on December 26th, alerting them to their travel status. John stated that John Andrew loved the outdoors, and it would not be out of the question for rope or cord to be found in his room or backpack. John Andrew typically took an airporter to the airport when departing Boulder for Atlanta. The death of innocence mentions a false Denver radio report that John Andrew was a suspect and might have JonBenet, which Fleet White attempted to stop. John Andrew is also listed as among the family who gathered at the Fernie's house. DNA analysis results from the JonBenet forensic files exclude John Andrew Ramsey as a source of DNA on certain exhibits. And Jeff Ramsey, John's brother, Jeff Ramsey, arrived in Boulder after the murder. John and his family had spent Thanksgiving at Jeff's home in Atlanta. John also mentioned that Jeff occasionally flew his Bonanza plane. During the 2000 August John interview in Atlanta, Jeff called John to express concern about Fleet White's behavior, stating that Fleet had a gun and was dangerous. The death of innocence states that Jeff was among the family members who gathered at the Fernie's house. Jeff also recalled giving the Whites a ride to the Westmorelands for a reception and then back to his own home, where Fleet and Priscilla made disparaging remarks about the Westmorelands lifestyle. DNA analysis results from the JonBenet forensic files exclude Jeff Ramsey as a source of DNA on certain exhibits. Okay, looking at this third group who seem like this sort of group of peripheral players. Jack Logan is a strange entry in the narrative. John calls him a weirdo who just sort of popped up after the murder and started inserting himself into the family space, washing his truck in the alley, making sympathy overtures at church. What's weird is that John didn't even know him beforehand. Now, when someone shows up like that, post-trauma, offering support without invitation, it raises flags. Not necessarily criminal, but psychologically off. From a criminology standpoint, offenders sometimes insert themselves into investigations either to monitor the fallout or feel control over the chaos they caused. And if Jack was indeed seen around the house in the days following, that suggests familiarity with the layout. Maybe not the house, but at least the alley, the neighborhood, the rhythm of the Ramsey routines. And what's funny is that he gave a DNA sample, so clearly he made enough of a ripple to warrant scrutiny. But if we're thinking about narrative framing, Jack could also be the convenient outsider character, the kind of person a defense team loves to wave in front of juries as the creepy red herring. He's the archetype of misdirection. Dr. Buff, on the other hand, is no outsider. He's the family pediatrician, and that makes him trusted, respected, and potentially more aware of family dynamics than most. He's also the guy who gave Patsy Valium and told police she was too medicated to talk. That's no small role. He shaped the early law enforcement response by framing Patsy as emotionally incapacitated, which may have delayed or softened police questioning. Now, that might have been out of compassion, sure, but it also makes him an agent of narrative control. From a forensic standpoint, when someone, especially a medical professional, acts as both caregiver and gatekeeper, it blurs the line between support and obstruction. Also consider that pediatricians often know more than parents think about injuries, about developmental red flags, about unusual patterns in a child's behavior. Did Dr. Buff ever see anything concerning? That part we don't know. But what's worth noting is that no one seems to ask. Stuart and Roxy Walker are another quiet pair. Friends who showed up after the murder, spent time at the Fernie's house, gave DNA samples, and then sort of faded into the background. What's interesting is that John mentioned them in a camping context. Couldn't recall details, and they were grouped under other good friends. That's a vague category in a case where proximity and presence mean everything. Did they show up because they were close emotionally, or were they summoned because they were loyal and discreet? From a philosophical angle, there's something about people who float just outside the immediate narrative but remain visible. They serve as proof of normalcy, people who knew the Ramseys in day-to-day life and didn't sound alarms. And yet, the fact that they're noted for camping, outdoorsy, rope knowledge types, makes them at the very least worth keeping on the mental radar. Sometimes in forensic profiling, lifestyle overlap becomes a bigger clue than people think. David Williams holds a curious dual role, both as the man whose kitchen hosted John while he wrote the reward letter, and as an investigator working with the Ramsey legal team. That puts him in a very controlled sphere. John didn't just trust him emotionally, he trusted him with the shaping of their post-murder defense. What's funny is that Williams is described as a former cop with years of experience, which basically means he had the tools to help manage risk, language, and legal fallout. And philosophically, when someone serves as both friend and enforcer, they become part of the architecture of power. They don't just support, they steer. It's like inviting someone into your house during a crisis not to comfort you, but to help you control the battlefield. And maybe there's nothing inherently sinister about that. But from a criminological lens, the early framing of innocence, press releases, reward statements, public cooperation, is almost always shaped by someone like Williams. John Andrew Ramsey, John's adult son, has been the subject of both false accusations and genuine curiosity. He wasn't in Boulder at the time of the murder, but his name still gets brought up, particularly in that bizarre radio rumor about him being a suspect. What's worth pausing on is the fact that Fleet White tried to shut that rumor down, which might suggest Fleet didn't think John Andrew had anything to do with it. But then John himself says it wouldn't be unusual to find rope or cord in John Andrew's belongings. That's a peculiar detail to volunteer. Maybe it's just practical. He loved the outdoors. But still, in a case defined by a garrote, that's not the kind of throwaway line you ignore. John Andrew was also said to have had two friends staying at the house, one of whom Patsy couldn't even name.
So you've got a college-age guy with friends in the house over the holidays, and he's flying back to Minneapolis on the 26th. That's a timeline worth tracking, even if the DNA didn't match.
Jeff Ramsey, John's brother, is another character whose role seems to expand and contract depending on what lens you look through. He was the Thanksgiving host just weeks before the murder, gave the Whites a ride in Atlanta, and later called John to warn that Fleet might be armed and dangerous. That's a big accusation, suggesting Fleet was mentally unstable and a possible threat to others, and yet this wasn't followed up by any police involvement, no restraining order, nothing. It almost feels like Jeff was running interference, trying to reroute the tension away from John and Patsy and towards someone else. And philosophically, family members often become the firewall, the people who say the things the accused can't say themselves. If Fleet was asking uncomfortable questions or showing signs of emotional collapse, then painting him as dangerous would be a neat way to invalidate him entirely. From a forensic standpoint, that kind of social positioning matters. It's not evidence, but it's often just as powerful. This whole group shares one thing in common: they orbit the crime without ever becoming its center. And that makes them easy to dismiss. But maybe that's the point. Each person here played a role that supported the Ramseys emotionally, logistically, or legally, but also helped buffer them from deeper scrutiny. Whether through strategic silence, active participation, or blind loyalty, they all helped hold the facade together. Philosophically, when a crime fractures a family, the inner circle often scrambles to protect the image, not the truth. That's what we might be seeing here, a series of human sandbags stacked to hold back the flood. What's also worth noting is how little pressure seems to have been applied to this group after the initial investigation. DNA samples were taken, roles were noted, and then nothing. No re-interviews, no contradictions explored. Either that means law enforcement genuinely cleared them, or it means this tier of the social circle was considered too peripheral to pursue. But in cases like this, the answers often live at the edges, not the center. And maybe the truth isn't that any one of these people was directly involved. Maybe it's that someone in this group knows more than they've ever said, and simply decided to protect the version of the story they could live with. On Bob Wallace, in a 1997 Patsy interview with the Boulder Police Department, Patsy identified Bob Wallace and a friend of his as the individuals who had placed the Christmas trees in the cellar room the previous year, suggesting they were aware of that area. Patsy described Bob as having a goatee. In a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John confirmed that Bob Wallace and his friend were involved in assembling the gingerbread house. John's impression was that they were both gay. Patsy reportedly met Bob at the mall when he was dressed as Santa Claus and invited him to their Christmas party. He had acted as Santa for them for about 3 years. John only interacted with him at parties. John was unsure if Bob had a key to their house, but doubted it, noting Patsy would have better knowledge. John believed Bob was artsy and likely had strong opinions on decorations. One on Bill M.C. Reynolds, in a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John identified Bill M.C. Reynolds as the Santa Claus at their Christmas party. Bill claimed to be very frail, which was why Mrs. Claus accompanied him. John believed it was her first time joining. Patsy met him in the mall in his Santa outfit and invited him to their party, a role he had performed for them for about 3 years. John had only conversed with him at these parties. In a 2000 August John interview in Atlanta, John mentioned that they initially had suspicions about MC Reynolds, and he attended JonBenet's memorial service. John recalled JonBenet stating that Santa was going to come visit her the evening of the 26th. The JonBenet forensic files list hair and blood samples collected from William M.C. Reynolds, Han of Father Roland Haverstock. In a December 26, 1996, police supplemental report, French Reverend Roland Haverstock from St. John's Episcopalian Church in Boulder was present at the Ramsey residence. The 1996 1226 search warrant also lists the pastor from St. John's Episcopalian Church as present. In a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John remembered Father Rollins sitting in the living room praying after JonBenet's body was found, and noted that comfort during that time came from him. John also referred to Father Roll's theory connecting the ransom amount to a vengeful psalm in the King James Bible. The Death of Innocence mentions our minister as one of the friends who provided guidance to the Ramseys after the ransom note was discovered. And Dennis Kelly. During the 2000 August John interview in Atlanta, John brought up Dennis Kelly, a painter who lived near Boulder and apparently painted our basement in either 95 or 1996. John described Kelly as fairly dysfunctional, noting that he wore an ankle monitor while working, implying restricted duty. John indicated that Kelly seemed to have some sort of grudge against the Ramseys, which he wouldn't explain, and knew them as rich people. Then Chris Wolf. In a 2000 August John interview in Atlanta, John stated that Chris Wolf was still very much of interest to me, but he was uncertain of his involvement. John had not known or heard of Chris Wolf before JonBenet's death. The 2001 December John Ramsey deposition reveals that Chris Wolf was the plaintiff in a lawsuit against the Ramseys. John stated that Wolf came to their attention as a possible suspect after Wolf's girlfriend contacted Patsy's parents expressing her firm belief that he was the killer and had been near our home. John noted that he had seen some investigative material related to Chris Wolf. The Death of Innocence provides more context, explaining that Jacqueline Dilson, Chris Wolf's girlfriend, contacted Patsy's mother because she firmly believed Wolf might be the person they were seeking. Chris Wolf is described as a reporter with a master's degree in journalism, whose strange behavior before Christmas was noted. The JonBenet forensic files mention Chris Wolf as someone who claimed to be a reporter and wrote articles about Access Graphics. His name surfaced in connection with John Ramsey's large bonus. So this seems like a group of what I might term as party guests who have these somewhat quiet roles, and they, in my opinion, play into this art of distraction in this whole ordeal. Bob Wallace is a peculiar figure. He was the guy who dressed up as Santa at the Ramseys' parties and supposedly placed the Christmas trees in the cellar room the year prior. Yes, the same cellar where JonBenet's body was found. Now that's already worth pausing over. Not because we're pointing fingers, but because from a criminological angle, knowledge of the layout, especially of that specific room, isn't trivial. That room wasn't well trafficked, so when someone had already physically interacted with it, they land on the radar. What's funny is that John described him as artsy and said he had a goatee and maybe strong opinions about decorations. Almost like he's brushing him off as harmlessly eccentric. But philosophically, eccentric doesn't mean innocent. Sometimes the most seemingly theatrical people are just covering for being overly familiar. And if Bob had access or keys even once, that opens a whole different door, literally and figuratively. Bill MC Reynolds is often lumped in the same Santa category, but his role is more symbolic. He was frail, needed a Mrs. Claus to assist him, and claimed it was her first time at the party. But the strange part is the emotional weight the Ramseys gave to this Santa act. JonBenet supposedly told someone that Santa would visit her again on the 26th. That detail feels scripted, or at least too oddly precise for a child to say without prompting. So you have to wonder, was that a miscommunication, a memory lapse, or did someone tell her that? If MC Reynolds didn't say it, who did? Also, he attended JonBenet's memorial, and people initially suspected him, but that suspicion faded. The forensic issue here is that ritual roles like Santa can camouflage access and lower suspicion. You're supposed to trust Santa. He's already inside the house emotionally. That's the problem. People often mistake emotional closeness for physical safety, but the two don't always align. Father Roland Haverstock provided spiritual comfort during the chaos. He was present in the living room after JonBenet's body was discovered, praying and offering stability. But what's interesting is his interpretation of the ransom amount. He connected it to Psalm 118, an a vengeful passage in the King James Bible. Now that's a whole other philosophical layer. If the ransom note really was connected to religious symbolism, then it suggests the killer wanted the message to feel divine or prophetic. It also makes you wonder, was Haverstock genuinely offering biblical insight, or was he shaping a softer spiritual narrative that would help steer attention away from the darker psychological themes at play? Pastors often serve that dual role, comforters and reputation stabilizers. And from a criminological standpoint, they can unintentionally contribute to misdirection, not by lying, but by reinterpreting events through the lens of spiritual warfare instead of criminal intent. Dennis Kelly is a name that barely makes the headlines, but the few details are disturbing. He painted the Ramsey basement, either in 1995 or 1996, and worked while wearing an ankle monitor. That already suggests he was on some kind of legal restriction. John described him as fairly dysfunctional and noted that he seemed to have a grudge. A grudge about what? That's never fully explained. And what's funny is how often we gloss over people like this. Tradesmen who had access, knew the house, possibly didn't like the Ramseys but kept that dislike quiet. In forensics, those are precisely the kinds of people who fall into the high-risk category: knowledge of the layout, emotional distance, perceived class resentment, and maybe a trigger event we'll never know about. Philosophically, it's also about invisibility. People who come in to paint your walls eventually disappear behind them, both literally and narratively. And that makes them dangerous, not because they're always guilty, but because they're so easy to forget. Chris Wolf is different because he doesn't hide in the background. He ends up suing the Ramseys. His girlfriend tells Patsy's mother that she believes he's the killer. He's a reporter, supposedly wrote about Access Graphics, and had a master's in journalism. That mix of personal connection and professional curiosity is messy. What's interesting is that John claims he never knew the guy before the murder, but Wolf was apparently close enough to be accused by someone inside his own house. In a forensic framing sense, this makes him the perfect scapegoat: unstable, curious, tangentially connected to the Ramseys through journalism, and dismissed just enough to look suspicious. But that's also what makes him potentially innocent. If his girlfriend was panicking or projecting, then he became a victim of overcorrection. It's the classic pattern of assigning guilt based on eccentric behavior rather than proximity or motive. And philosophically, it raises a bigger question. Are we more likely to believe someone did it just because we don't understand them? What's also funny is how many of these people are characterized by their costumes or labels. Santa Claus, minister, painter, reporter. Those aren't just titles, they're identities that mask deeper roles. And from a criminology lens, the problem with titles is that they create immediate assumptions. You don't expect Santa to kill a child. You don't expect a minister to manipulate a narrative. You don't expect a painter to hold a grudge strong enough to plan revenge. But when the crime is staged, and this one shows multiple signs of staging, then everyone who could have played a part in the stage design becomes a candidate for re-examination. Also, think about how many of these people had access to the house in indirect ways. Wallace placed trees in the cellar. MC Reynolds was at the party. Kelly painted the basement. Wolf wrote about the business tied to the bonus. None of these are direct links, but they're thematic ones. They all tie into areas of the crime scene that weren't public knowledge, or they brush up against family routines and vulnerabilities. From a logical standpoint, it's not about picking one of them as the culprit. It's about asking whether the crime was committed by someone who understood the whole environment. Not just the house, but the people, the stress, the social calendar, the religious ties. That's a very specific kind of awareness. And what might be worth holding on to is this. While this group doesn't scream guilt, they whisper about familiarity. They represent the people you will let into your life during times of celebration or maintenance when your guard is down. And in crimes like these, it's not always the intruder in the night. It's the person you thought you had no reason to be afraid of. One unnamed Shreveport friend and Tucson woman. In a 1997 John interview with the Boulder Police Department, John stated he did not know a person from Shreveport who had contacted the police, sarcastically noting, "I have lots of new friends I didn't know about." He placed a woman from Tucson in the same category. Patsy, in a separate 1997 interview, also stated she didn't know anyone in Shreveport, but speculated it could be someone she knew who had moved there. John reiterated in a 1998 June interview that he had no clue who that woman is from Tucson. Or in Tim Murtaugh, a 1997 Patsy interview with the Boulder Police Department, describes an incident in Charlevoix where John was preparing for a yacht race. A fellow, later identified as Tim Murtaugh, was supposed to be part of the crew but failed to show up, forcing them to find a woman crew member to qualify. This made both John and Fleet miffed. Bob and Woody. In a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John mentioned Bob and his son's name, who is a friend of Burke's, is Woody, who were really into camping a lot and Big Sailor. They had moved to Seattle, and John noted that Patsy would know their last name. John discussed them when considering the origin of the chord found with JonBenet. Under David Haskell, in a 1997 Patsy interview with the Boulder Police Department, Patsy named David Haskell in Denver as one of two photographers who primarily did JonBenet's portraits. And Robert Phillips, in a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane. John stated that Robert Phillips, who used to go by Nell, worked with Patsy at Hayes Microcomputer Products in Atlanta as a programmer. An unnamed odd duck at Foyer Group, John Ramsey, in a 1998 June interview with Smith and Kane, recalled seeing a couple of odd ducks at the church foyer dinner group. One individual was an older guy, maybe 55, 60, 65, who wore a distinctive little cap, almost like a Jewish yarmulke. John talked to him and found him a little strange based on his comments, though nothing related to children. John had seen this man in church before and speculated that his name might be Dan Burns, on Dennis Brolin. In a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John stated that Dennis Brolin worked for us for several years as a marketing guy at Access Graphics, but he was considered a little low on horsepower. Dennis eventually resigned, reportedly because he felt his advancement was too slow. John recalled him leaving Access Graphics around 1995 to 1996 and becoming an architect who moved to the mountains. John explicitly stated he was not suspicious of him. Kenneth Bishop John Ramsey, in a 1998 June interview with Smith and Kane, mentioned Ken Bishop, Access Graphics in the context of locksmith work at their house. Bill Fairfield, in a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John identified Bill Fairfield as the president of Indicom, a public company, and Scott Westfall, John Ramsey, in a 1998 June interview with Smith and Kane, stated he bought a Bonanza plane from Scott Westfall, a salesman, in Jeffco about a year prior. In Grady Parsons, in a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John recognized the name Grady Parsons as his predecessor but couldn't recall why, only that he looked older. This is a group of what I might call stragglers, strangers, and silent watchers. I feel like these are kind of like a group of people somewhat close to the Ramseys who can be termed the outliers to the inner circle. The woman from Shreveport and the woman from Tucson both fall into that strange category of new friends we didn't know we had, as John sarcastically put it, and that sarcasm might be more telling than it seems. It's easy to laugh off tipsters or concerned callers, but from a criminology standpoint, unsolicited calls after a crime sometimes come from people with either genuine knowledge, delusions, or guilty consciences trying to redirect attention. What's worth noting here is that both women inserted themselves into the case without clear motive. Were they attention seekers, or did they know something unprovable? Or worse, did they get too close to the truth and get written off as crazy? Philosophically, it raises that idea that sometimes the truth leaks through the mouths we least expect to take seriously. Maybe they saw something. Maybe they heard something. And maybe the reason we don't hear about them again is because they weren't supposed to stay in the narrative. Tim Murtaugh is one of those blink and you miss him characters, but what's interesting is how irritated John and Fleet reportedly were that he didn't show up for their yacht race in Charlevoix. That's a strange detail to hold on to in the middle of a homicide investigation. Why does it matter? Maybe it doesn't. Or maybe it's one of those unresolved tensions that seems petty until you realize how often passive grudges become active motivators. From a criminological angle, failing to show up for a commitment, especially one tied to tradition and masculinity like sailing, can be interpreted as betrayal by some people. And what's funny is that this little anecdote places Tim in John's mental map of people who let him down. Even if he's not involved in the murder at all, that psychic undercurrent of disappointment matters. It means something was unresolved. Bob and Woody, the camping duo, come across like background extras. Except John remembered that Burke was friends with Woody. That makes them more than outdoorsy acquaintances. That makes them household adjacent. And John saying they were big into camping and sailing raises questions about whether these two had experience with knots, cordage, or tools. In a vacuum, that's meaningless. But in a case where ligatures and knots play a central role, that detail suddenly jumps in importance. Philosophically, the thing to sit with here is that people who are functionally invisible, parents of a friend, neighbors, recreational buddies, can often access your space and time without ever being clocked as a threat. And if the motive was more symbolic than direct, let's say revenge or jealousy or obsession, then that invisibility becomes strategic, not accidental. David Haskell is one of two photographers mentioned, and what's notable is that Patsy names him specifically as doing JonBenet's portraits. That's already intimate. When someone photographs your child repeatedly, they start to see the child through a certain lens, literally and figuratively. They see what the family wants to present, but also what's underneath. They see who the child becomes when no one's posing her. From a psychological angle, photographers sit in this weird in-between space, part voyeur, part storyteller, part confidant. If Haskell was around enough to capture multiple portraits, it means he had access to JonBenet's demeanor, her behavior, her image. Now, nothing suggests he's a suspect, but the philosophical question is, how much do people who document a child's public image know about the private one? And could they have been targeted for what they knew or for how they presented her? Robert Phillips is one of those names that sounds forgettable until you realize he worked with Patsy at Hayes Micro in Atlanta and apparently used to go by Nell. That detail about the nickname makes it more memorable, especially if it hints at some kind of rebranding, personal transformation, or social identity shift. And what's interesting is that John barely mentions him, even though he worked closely with Patsy. That tells us two things. Either Phillips wasn't that close, or John didn't want to acknowledge how close he was to Patsy. From a logical standpoint, any co-worker from Patsy's past who was close enough to visit, be invited, or even just remain in touch is worth noting, because old friends, or former ones, can bring unresolved jealousy, rivalry, or even debt. And in forensics, old ghosts sometimes resurface when tragedy strikes, especially if they see an opening to insert themselves. The unnamed odd duck at the church foyer group is one of the strangest mentions in this entire category. John recalls him wearing something like a yarmulke and saying odd things, not about kids, but just off-putting in general. That sort of mild discomfort is easy to dismiss, but in profiling, that's sometimes the type of person who slips through cracks. What might be worth considering is that John don't remember this man at all, even though he said he never talked to him much, which means something about this guy stuck. Maybe it was his look, maybe it was the vibe, maybe it was the way he hovered. In cases like this, where the crime feels personal but not necessarily intimate, that kind of ambient observer can be more dangerous than the people standing at the center. Dennis Brolin was a former marketing guy at Access Graphics who eventually left to become an architect. John describes him as a little low on horsepower, which is another way of calling someone unremarkable. But what's interesting is that Brolin quit because he felt his growth was stalled. That's a potential grudge point. People who feel undervalued or overlooked by their employer don't always vocalize their resentment until something cracks. The resignation itself doesn't suggest much, but if he moved to the mountains and had faded into obscurity, That kind of physical and emotional withdrawal is the kind of thing that removes a person from suspicion, even if it shouldn't. Philosophically, people who self-isolate after leaving a high-pressure corporate environment might carry bitterness no one thinks to check for, and sometimes, just sometimes, those people still watch from afar. What ties this whole group together is that they aren't quite friends and they aren't quite strangers. They live in the in-between. People who were either just close enough to enter the family's orbit or just weird enough to be remembered. And that's where the danger lives in cases like this. It's not always the person sleeping in the next room. It's the person who slipped in and out of the narrative quietly, like fog under a door. What might be worth noting is that John recalls some of these people with sharp detail and others with vague dismissal. And that inconsistency matters. Because memory has motive too. And the people you barely remember or pretend not to are often the ones your subconscious is trying to bury. Larry Mason, in a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John recalled Larry Mason advising him to stick around for a couple days rather than immediately going to Atlanta after Beth's death. John remembered speaking with Linda Arndt and Larry Mason at the Fernie's house, and Larry Mason being involved in discussions about their police interviews. A December 26, 1996 police supplemental report, JonBenet Ramsey, states that Sergeant Larry Mason met with John Ramsey for approximately 40 minutes. An identified friend who tried to solve the case in a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, when asked who told him about a profile image of a killer from a recent attack, John simply stated, "Just a friend. Everybody has tried to solve this, tried to help." An unnamed people at the Foyer group, John Ramsey, in a 1998 June interview with Smith and Kane, mentioned that many people at the Foyer dinner group were strangers to him, including a couple of odd ducks. He also recalled a couple who had lost a child who lived down the street, were invited to the party and stayed for about 30 to 45 minutes. John had never met them before. Denise Wolf, John's secretary, Denise Wolf, was highly aware of his schedule, more than anybody on my staff. In a 1998 June John interview with Smith and Kane, John mentioned that Denise had a boyfriend who was a little strange and had attended their office Christmas parties annually. John expressed concern about this boyfriend, recalling something about kids and he hated kids or hated me or something. The JonBenet forensic files note that another employee, Cheryl, who sat near Denise, could have easily known John's bonus information due to their close proximity. Lastly, you have a group of who I might call the gatekeepers, floaters, and those who knew too much. Larry Mason is one of those people who floats between the inner and outer circle, close enough to be part of key decisions, but far enough removed to avoid becoming central to the narrative. He's a sergeant, a law enforcement figure, and he was at the Fernie's house the day of the murder, speaking with John for roughly 40 minutes. That's a long time in a crisis. What's funny is how little comes from that interaction. What did they talk about? Logistics, emotion, strategy? Philosophically, when a police officer is in that kind of intimate proximity so early on, it raises questions about how much shaping of the story happened right then and there. Was it a moment of genuine support or a moment where boundaries between authority and sympathy got blurred? That early access to John's mental state before legal counsel took over might have revealed more than anyone was ready to acknowledge. And that silent sense, that's not an accident. The unnamed friend who gave John the profile sketch of a killer is easy to brush off, but maybe shouldn't be. Everyone has a friend trying to solve the mystery, sure, but what kind of person gives someone a profile sketch of a killer based on a recent attack? That implies someone in John's life was already comparing cases, connecting dots, and getting involved in the narrative construction. And if we look at it from a criminological standpoint, this kind of input can either be helpful or wildly manipulative. Because once you plant that idea that there's a type, a pattern, an external threat, it makes it easier for the mind to avoid looking inward. That kind of externalizing is the seed of a cover story, even if unintentional. And what's interesting is that John never names the person. That anonymity either means he genuinely forgot or that the person was close enough that naming them would make things messier. The Foyer dinner group is one of those social gatherings that seems innocent until you think about the timing. John admits he didn't know half the people there, including an older man in a yarmulke-like cap and a couple who had just lost a child. Why does that matter? Well, let's sit with this for a second. A couple grieving the death of their own child is invited to a Christmas dinner party with the Ramseys, where JonBenet is performing. That adds a strange psychological layer, almost like parallel grief waiting to happen. And that older man John calls an odd duck was apparently eccentric, but not directly suspicious. But that's the thing about eccentricity. It's always harmless until it isn't. From a profiling angle, people who pass as quirky but disconnected can hide in plain sight, especially in church settings, where trust is implicit and background checks are rare. That entire dinner group, if you really think about it, was full of emotional contradictions. Grief, performance, secrecy. Denise Wolfe, John's secretary, is a sleeper character. John flat out says she knew his schedule better than anyone. That's significant. In a case like this, where timing, absence, and access all matter, the person who manages your calendar is functionally your alibi, or your weakest point. She also had a boyfriend described as a little strange who hated kids, or hated John. The quote's fuzzy. That kind of statement doesn't just slip out without weight. If Denise's boyfriend had access to the office, the company party, or heard anything in private conversations, then we were talking about a third party actor who had motive, maybe not to harm JonBenet specifically, but to take something from John. Philosophically, secretaries often live in the gray space between professional loyalty and personal vulnerability. They overhear things, they protect reputations, but they also carry grudges by proxy. Cheryl, another office employee who sat near Denise, was said to have had potential access to bonus information. That might sound trivial at first, but the ransom note used the exact number of John's bonus. That makes her placement critical. Now, is that enough to raise alarms? Not necessarily, but if we apply deductive reasoning, and we know the killer didn't get that number from the media, and we know the house wasn't broken into, then someone in the loop, either at work or through a social connection, had to have known that figure. Cheryl's proximity to Denise, who was already positioned as someone whose partner disliked the Ramseys, creates a subtle network of indirect exposure. Maybe neither of them acted alone. Maybe neither of them acted at all. But the link between bonus access and potential resentment deserves more scrutiny than it's ever gotten. What's also interesting is how many people in this group aren't remembered for what they did, but for what they knew. Mason, the friend with the killer sketch, Denise, Cheryl, they're all remembered based on their information proximity, not their actions. That's a big red flag in forensic psychology. Because when the most important detail about someone is what they could have heard, seen, or inferred, you're probably looking at someone who mattered more than they appeared to. And when none of those people are followed up with publicly, that's often a sign that their roles were quietly neutralized, not legally, but narratively. Now take a step back and think about the overlap. People who manage information like secretaries, people who shape memory like pastors, people who offer profiles like unnamed friends, and people who control access like law enforcement. They don't leave fingerprints, but they leave impressions. And impressions in a case like this were everything, because the truth didn't just get buried, it got layered. Philosophically, this is the group that helped harden the narrative shell around the Ramseys, not with lies, but with controlled exposure, controlled commentary, controlled chaos. And what might be worth really sitting with is this. When the inner circle protects the body, this group protected the bloodstream, the calendar, the gossip, the perception. They didn't carry the crime, but they carried the currents around it. And when you follow the flow of information instead of the fingerprints, this group starts looking less peripheral and more like the ones who knew where the exits were before the smoke ever started. That's all I have for today. I might end by saying this. Maybe the real story here isn't just about JonBenet or the house on 15th Street or the ransom note. Maybe it's also about the people orbiting the case, the ones who were too loyal, too silent, too quietly absorbed into the story without ever being questioned again. Because if we're being honest, the way people act after a crime tells you just as much as what they were doing before it. The sudden distance, the controlling of information, the recasting of roles, all of that starts to look a little suspicious when you step back. It's like the crime didn't just fracture the family, it split the entire web of social relationships wide open, and then everyone scrambled to pick a side, whether they admitted it or not. And what's funny, well, not funny, but telling, is that some of these names fade while others stick, not because they were more involved, but because they fit a certain narrative. The odd duck, the grieving couple, the disgruntled coworker, the forgotten secretary, they all slot into convenient archetypes, which might make us feel like we've covered every angle, but maybe that's just part of the smokescreen. So if we're going to talk about truth, we have to be willing to look at the people who were never really given the chance to speak, or were quietly ushered off stage before they could. Because sometimes the people who knew the least are remembered the most, and the ones who knew too much just disappeared behind the curtain. As always, I truly appreciate your love and support. Thanks for being here, and thank you for listening. Don't forget to like and share and subscribe if you haven't. I would truly appreciate it. And I guess until next time, take care of yourself.